I want to acknowledge that this topic comes in part from inspiration from an article that Professor Jennifer Hochschild wrote in 2010 addressing this issue, and I've assigned that article many times to my classes and have talked about it in my courses over the years. And so I took from that article, which was 2010, and thought about it in more recent times and tried to sort of add my own spin on that. And it comes from a premise, or at least a paradox, if you will, that we often start with the premise that a strong, thriving democracy needs informed citizens, educated, informed citizens who care passionately about politics or policymaking and know a lot about the political system. And yet, throughout American history, we've expanded access to the ballot, expanded our democratic participation to every citizen in the country, but we do so oftentimes even by encouraging uninformed people to participate and to vote. And we've done that in both contemporary settings and historically. And so it creates this interesting question of how do we square that circle of asking everyone to participate, but also hoping and encouraging all citizens to be knowledgeable. And this is kind of a problem in some cases. It's humorous to some extent. Some in the audience may remember Jay Leno's old jaywalking skits he used to do for The Tonight Show, where he'd go out on the street and ask people some questions like this to this woman. This was her answer, and we laugh at it, but it actually is endemic in some ways to our broader electoral or country. So, for example, in American National Election Study, which is fielded every 4 years, and during election time, we ask people basic questions and facts about American politics. And so back into the 1950s, we've been asking people questions like, which party controls the US House? What's the majority party in the House of Representatives? And somewhere between 30 and 50% of Americans may not know or don't know the answer to that question. And this is the policymaking, lawmaking body of our federal system. Even worse, perhaps, we also have asked, this was asked over a 30-year period, if citizens on the survey could name any of the candidates running for Congress in their home district. And 60 to 70% of respondents across time didn't know the names of either of the two candidates. And so this is sort of an issue that we might be concerned about. It's how much knowledge and awareness do people have about the system that they're participating in. And to some extent, this question is also historical. And so I find we don't have survey data over the 1800s, but we do have interesting sort of data on the expansion of the electorate over the course of our 240 or so year history. And so this is a graph that shows a number of things, but it's attempts to show the change in the number of eligible voters there are in the population from election to election back into the 1790s. Now, as a point of comparison, the orange-ish dots show the change in the US population. And so over the course of years, pretty consistently, the population of the United States has grown between 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% every couple of years. But the number of people eligible to vote, the number who have the legal right to vote, has expanded in sort of fits and starts. And so the gray dots represent the change in the percentage of eligible voters from the previous midterm or presidential election. And then the black line tries to find the pattern or smooth it out to some extent. And so we see some spikes at key moments in American history. The first one is right around the time we would identify as the Jacksonian era, where we begin to move, after the first few decades of the American Republic, from a system where voting was restricted to citizens, white men with property, to white men without property. And that was a big expansion of the electorate that was led in part by the populist efforts of Andrew Jackson. We expand the electorate again immediately after the Civil War, when through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we enfranchise now freed slaves. We, of course, then begin a 100-plus year period of fighting for those rights for African Americans to vote. But immediately after the Civil War, we see a large influx of new voters. We see it again in the early 1900s with women's suffrage after the 19th Amendment. The electoral voting eligible population nearly doubles in the early 1920s. And then most recently, a smaller spike, but still a really important one, we see 18, 19, and 20-year-olds gain the right to vote with the 26th Amendment. And what's interesting about this is that these changes are celebrated, and they came about as a result of so much blood, sweat, and tears and movement from social movements and activists in ways that are really powerful and important. But they also brought into the electorate, for the most part and oftentimes, large new sets of voters who arguably knew less about the political system than the people who were on the rolls previous to these changes. So in the Jacksonian period, non-propertied white men were on average less educated than the sort of more aristocratic landed white men of the time. And many freed slaves did not know how to write or read. And with apologies to the college students in the crowd, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds oftentimes know less about the complicated politics of the day in comparison to their parents or their grandparents and so forth. And so we celebrate these changes, but they have that sort of feature of the paradox there also. And so how do we resolve that? How do we handle that? How do we deal with that? How do we consider it? And so there's a couple different things I'd like to mention and talk about. The first is that we might just kind of throw this whole thing up on its head and make the case that Americans really aren't that ignorant. They're in fact really savvy, that American voters are pretty savvy at learning what they need to know pretty quickly and make informed decisions on the basis of somewhat limited information. Which party is the candidate running under? What does my neighbor think? What does my coworker think? What did I hear on the radio? Or that advertisement may have been fairly persuasive. And so we can kind of make savvy decisions somewhat quickly. And I would be pretty much an advocate for that, except I'm nervous about this particular answer to the paradox in today's environment where we have really big concerns about misinformation, where artificial intelligence, deep fakes, make us question and wonder what's true, what's real, and this is just going to get harder and harder, such that the little nuggets of information that we use as shortcuts might not be real. And so we need to perhaps think again about our ability to rely on just quick pieces of information to make voting decisions. Another answer might be that maybe other institutions carry the load for us, that this is the old adage that if you need something done, give it to a busy person, that activists actually represent the rest of us, that there are people passionate about all sorts of issues, climate change, racial justice, income inequality, abortion rights, pro-life activists, and that they do the work for us, and that allows us to sort of, in a sense, tune out a little bit more easily. That's also potentially helpful, except maybe not in today's political environment, in part because those institutions that we've relied on in the past, whether they be academic institutions or the media or parties or groups, are less trusted by the larger group of Americans than ever before. In fact, trust is at an all-time low for many of these institutions. And there's a growing divide between the people who are active and highly educated and the rest of Americans that are less interested or active in participating in politics. And that divide is making it harder to believe that the people who are deeply involved in an issue adequately represent the rest of Americans. And so perhaps we can't really rely on that. So another option is that democracies maybe don't really need knowledgeable citizens, that in fact apathy to some extent can stabilize our system, that if we're not paying that close attention, the status quo stays in place, and the policy swings that can happen with an emotional public happen less often, and this is good to some extent for stability. And sort of relatedly, it might be that we activate only when things are dire, and that's okay because it can stabilize the system. And I might call this the break glass when in case of emergency theory of politics. So gas prices are high, eggs cost a lot, inflation is high, mortgage interest rates are going up. We should throw the bums out and start over, and that recalibrates our political system without us having to be super knowledgeable about what's going on. And that could help, and that's been pretty effective perhaps in the past, but I would argue and maybe be concerned about the fact that there's an entire ecosystem of people out there today who want to activate those dire threats at every turn. That every single thing that happens is an example of the world falling apart. Every single segment on cable news is about how awful and evil the other party is, to the point that we are hyperventilating over everything that happens in politics, and everything seems dire. And so it's hard to distinguish the difference between what really needs change and what is just normal politics. And so in that sense, I'm left back to the possibility that we should double down on the importance of knowledge, that we can't explain our way out of this paradox. And that is perhaps that we can learn on the job, that we should participate in the political system, and that we'll get good at it in doing that. And if that's the case, then there's a few things that we should do, or we should prioritize, I think, in order to make that possible. The first is that we should really emphasize the importance of education. Not only just education in terms of it being accessible to all Americans, but I think we don't do a great job, and we should do a better job, of educating young citizens about what it means to be a citizen. Not just their rights, but also their responsibilities. And we don't really teach that. We don't teach civic citizenship responsibilities as much. And if we did that, we could educate our young citizens to grow into being more informed and knowledgeable. The second argument would be that we should expand and embrace a broader understanding of what the common good is. I think we sometimes think of it as, in a short way, of helping other people and being supportive of other people in our community. And that's an important definition of the common good. But it should also involve and encourage engagement in the political system. Perhaps we think of politics as being a little swarmy, a little not as enjoyable as other forms of engagement with our community. It's filled with people who might be corruptible. I don't want to run for office because I don't want to put myself out there. But if we expand our understandings of the common good to be about investing in our community's political systems, then perhaps we can see that effort as being valuable and important to building back our communities. And so that could mean anything from going to school board meetings, running for local office, writing a letter to the editor, or showing up at a meeting and hearing what your elected officials have to say. I also encourage people perhaps to become journalists, local journalists even, covering politics at the local level so that citizens become aware of what's happening in their towns and cities. And as a final matter, if you're going to do nothing else, you should vote. I happen to think it's fun, but also political science tells us that it can be habit forming, that if you vote once or vote twice, it's very easy to continue that process of voting. And there might actually be a feedback loop where voting encourages us to become more knowledgeable about politics. And so if we remember those things and we try to understand the importance of investing in our communities and our political system, maybe that's the way we end up with a stronger and more vibrant political democracy. So thank you.